Doctors, what are the most memorable last words you've heard from a patient? Story 1. My grandmother's last words, spoken as a nurse was checking on her and accidentally waking her up, were, "Good God, you scared me." She went back to sleep and never woke up. Passed about a week later. Opinion. Would have been funnier if she said, "You scared the life out of me." Story 2. I'm not a doctor, but I am an ER nurse. I've heard a few final words. One that sticks out to me was a young man, 20s, who was in a pretty bad car accident. He had lost a leg and, as a result, lost so much blood. The last thing he said was pretty much asking his girlfriend if his dog was alright. The dog had been in the car and, according to his dad, didn't make it. I cried in my car for a while after that shift. He was so worried about his dog that he had no idea how close to being unalive he was. Opinion. I like to think he and his dog crossed over to heaven together. Story 3. I'm not a doctor, but a nurse. And I've worked with the elderly for quite some time now. Most have been silent in their last moments. One old man sighed out a "finally" and went on. He just looked so relieved to finally be unalive. One lady with severe dementia kinda had no idea what was going on. She was pretty out of it, and her last words were that she missed her mommy and that she hoped Mom would bake bread, 'cause she was hungry. Another lady was absolutely terrified, and I tried my best to calm her down. It's heartbreaking. You can't really do anything with their fear, other than calm them as best as you can. The lady asked me, "Will everything be okay?" And I told her that, yeah, everything would be fine. The kids were fine, and everything was fine, and the flowers were watered. She didn't say anything after that, and passed on an hour later. Opinion. I could never do that kind of job. Story 4. Just a quick note. I am not a doctor, but I am a state-tested nurse aide. My grandma, who was like a second mom to me, was diagnosed with 6 different types of that serious illness. I was one of her main caregivers during this time. Toward the end, when things were starting to get more intense, we made peace. And we told her she could go whenever she was ready. She told me she was holding on to meet her only great-grandchild. I was 20 weeks pregnant at the time. Fast forward to April 15th of this year, I went to visit her in the hospital with my 5-month-old daughter. I was there to both hang out and explain some medical things to her. She was just hurting real badly and was going to have paperwork filed to have a nurse visit her at home twice a day. Despite the pain, things seemed fine. As good as they could be considering the situation, other than her arm hurting so much she could barely move it. She was asleep when we arrived, and while I was writing her a little note saying, "Just stopped by to visit. We love you," she woke up. We had an amazing chat like nothing was wrong. She was joking about my grandpa leaving the TV on the History Channel and complaining about how bad the food was. Right before we left, she squeezed my daughter's hand and said, "I'm so glad I got to see you one last time. Make sure Grandpa takes you to the park for me. Grandma loves you both so much." Those were the last words she ever said. She passed away in the hospice care 4 days later. My grandpa and I never expected her to go so quickly. We knew she was in pain, but she hid it so well. I'm so thankful she woke up to see my daughter one last time. Sorry for the emotional post. Writing this made everything feel real. And I'm bawling as I type. Hug your loved ones tight. You'll never know if it will be the last time you see them. Opinion. It's quite strange how the elderly and sick can live so long and fight so hard for one thing, only to let go in the end. Story 5. A nurse once shared something with me about the different types of patients she cares for. She said that the ones who are ready to go are usually the easiest for her to support. She gently holds their hand and lets them know they're not alone. The hardest ones, though, are the fighters. There was this one man in his 70s who kept saying, "No, I'm not ready. I still have a lot of living to do. He passed away later that day. She said she cried after he passed, and one of the other nurses told her, maybe you should rethink your career if you're going to cry. But the head nurse pulled her aside and said, no, honey, if there ever comes a time when you don't cry, that's when you need to stop being a nurse. Opinion. I agree with that. If a medical worker doesn't care for their patients, they should consider quitting. Story 6. I was trying to patch up a young guy to be flown out for emergency care. His body had been badly injured. He was fighting hard to stay alive, gasping and asking me to teach him how to pray. That moment changed me as a person. Since then, I've become a lot colder than before. Opinion. Helpful defense mechanism. Compassion fatigue, I think it's called. Story 7. Not a doctor, but I lost my mom to a serious illness 3 years ago. The whole family, my dad, her 4 children and I, were gathered around her bed. My dad and mom made the decision to stop the medications and let her go, as she was in too much pain. There were no final words. But just before she passed, after we took her off the medications, she opened her eyes and saw all of us around her, filled with love. It's not a statement, but knowing that her last sight was her family surrounding her with love gives me peace. I miss you, Mom, and I will love you forever. Opinion. That's a good way to go, surrounded by loved ones. Story 8. Not a doctor, but a paramedic who has heard way too many last words. These are rarely like you see in the movies, where the patient says something profound and peacefully slips away. In reality, a lot of them happen just before someone goes into cardiac or respiratory arrest, or as their condition worsens. It's long, painful, and hard to watch. This really hurts. A 22-year-old who flew off his motorbike after being hit by a large vehicle. He went into shock afterward, and we couldn't save him. I was still a student at the time, and while his last words might sound somewhat humorous, they still stick with me. I'm glad my wife didn't have to find me. An elderly man who suffered severe burns after falling asleep while cooking lunch for himself and his wife. A massive fire broke out. This one still hurts to think about. Something I find really interesting is the phenomenon of impending doom. The number of patients I've treated for heart attacks, ruptured arteries, and other severe conditions whose last words have been something like, "I think my time has come," is striking. When you see a patient who looks pale, sweaty, and really unwell, and they tell you they think they're going to not survive, you listen, because they probably are. Opinion. I guess most people's last moments are not pretty at all. Story 9. Nurse here. I'll never forget her. I had been a nurse for about 6 months when this happened. It was near the beginning of my shift. I had just finished introducing myself to my new group of patients. One of my patients called me over and said, "Get my daughter out of the room. It's time for me to go." I was really confused at first. I had just left her room not long ago, where I had met her and her daughter. We joked around a bit, and she had just gotten up and walked. The report I had on her didn't mention anything that made me think she was unstable. I went to check on her, and I saw the daughter walking out of the room. I asked what was going on, and the daughter said, "She's telling me to leave and that it's time for her to go. She's not used to being in a hospital, so I think she's just being emotional." I told her I would go and check on her. When I entered the room, she didn't respond to me, and there was no pulse. We couldn't bring her back. It was so sudden for everyone, the family, the staff, and myself. No one expected it. From the short time I'd met her, I could tell she was a joy to be around and obviously loved and respected by everyone who knew her. The nurses and the family all had a moment to grieve together. I often think about her last words and wonder how long she knew. She didn't sound scared. She just said it in a way that made it clear she knew it was her time. Opinion. That is so incredibly haunting. Story 10. My dad was ill with a stomach bug after just having an operation. I was staying with my parents for the night when he got up to get a drink of water and fell down the stairs. I picked him up and he was a bit dizzy, but he wouldn't let me call for help. 20 minutes later, he got up to go to the bathroom and collapsed. I rushed to his side and asked, "Are you okay? Are you in pain?" His last words were, "No pain. I'm fine. No pain." And in about 30 seconds, the warmth of his body went cold in my hands. I feel privileged to have been there with him in that moment. Opinion. It is a privilege. Story 11. I am a nurse. It was just after breakfast. My patient was a little old lady who had been on the ward for ages, but could never remember my name and always called me Matt. She had a cardiac arrest in front of me. We started CPR and defined her. And in the only time I have ever seen this happen, in a cardiac arrest, she immediately regained consciousness. She looked directly at me, addressed me by my actual name, and said, "Alex." I think it was the Vegemite toast. She then promptly vomited and lost consciousness again, and we could not get her back. It is to date one of the strangest things that has ever happened to me. Opinion. To be fair, I think it was the Vegemite. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell button to receive notifications to my latest videos.